And good morning or good afternoon, art historians. My name is Allison Napier, and I am here to lead us through another exciting day of art history review. I hope you're all healthy and well, and thanks for joining me. It's our hope that you're finding these sessions helpful, very beneficial in the big picture, and informative, as well as a good way to review and practice the skills you need for the AP exam. And so let's get started. Here, there's our screen. There I am. I set up a Twitter account just for you guys. So if you have any questions or you want to send me any information about, how you're preparing for the AP exam, you can reach me at AC Napier CB on Twitter. So I would love to hear from you. And before we get started, I want to let you know that Jack has worked really, really hard on this PowerPoint for you, and he is completely wiped out. And he and Lovey are both currently sleeping, and we hope that they stay that way. Sorry for the toy carnage. When you have a puppy, as many of you know, every toy must be touched at least 3 times a day. So everybody's snoozing at my house. They're all exhausted from all of this work they've been doing. And so that leaves me to help you with the arts of the Islamic world. And so we're going to focus on skill 2D today, which deals with artistic decision making. And there's lots of conscious decision making when we talk about art in general, but especially the arts of the Islamic world. Context is very important. Is it sacred or secular? Forms, styles, colors. Is it made out of wood or tile? Where are you using calligraphy? All of those factor into artistic production. So we're going to work on this skill using the Islamic works in Unit 3. We're also going to connect to Central Asia, which isn't on the exam in Unit 7, but Africa is. So we'll look at the Mosque of Jenne before we leave today. And what you're going to see is that while Islam is a global religion, how it manifests in different areas of the world, throughout the world, is dependent upon cultural and geographic context. And so we're going to see this particularly in differences among mosques. And while mosques require certain components to meet the requirements of the faith, there are regional variations based on the availability of material or the tradition of building, as well as the preferences of patrons. So we talk about Islam beginning in Central Asia, and here is Medina and Mecca. Those are two big cities in the Islamic story. And so we'll talk a little bit very briefly about the tenets of Islam and kind of what is Islam about. But it spreads from there, as you can see, into South and Southeast Asia, Africa, as well as into the southern parts of Europe. So first, a little about Islam. And you have to understand the faith to understand these sites and these works that we're going to look at. And the religion, its beliefs and practices impact artistic production in many ways. So Muhammad was a merchant from Mecca. He had his first religious experience in 610, and he was visited by the Angel Gabriel, and instructed to recite. And these recitations will form what will become the Islamic holy book, the Quran. And Muhammad was very critical of polytheistic religion, and he preached the religion of the one and only God from whom he received these revelations. So the followers of Islam are referred to as Muslims, those who submit to the will of God, submit to the recitations. And Islam requires living according to the rules laid down in these revelations that were communicated by Muhammad throughout his lifetime, as well as trying to follow in Muhammad's footsteps and live a life like the prophet, as he's often referred to. So Muhammad flees in 622 because the message he was offering to the public, to people, caused some pushback from the public. And so this flight is known as the Hijra, or the immigration, and he goes to the city of Medina, which is an oasis, which is also referred to as the city of the prophet. 8 years later, he returns to Mecca with soldiers. He takes control of the city, and he converts the population to Islam and destroys all the idols in the structure you see here, the Kaaba. When he takes over, he decides to preserve the Kaaba, which was this, and now this is the symbolic center of Islam, right in the heart of Mecca. And this is associated with the era of Abraham and Ishmael, who are the common ancestors of both the Jews and the Arabs. So Muslims live their lives according to the revelations in the Quran. They profess the faith to one God. They submit to prayer 5 times a day. They give alms to the poor. And if possible, they try to make this pilgrimage to Mecca once a year. And you can see that it is a large square structure right in the center of a mosque, which is built up around it. And you can see all of the faithful Muslims there. They've made their pilgrimage and they are now praying in the direction of the Kaaba. And that's one of the things when you pray each day, you pray in the direction of Mecca. So if you're in Africa, you could be praying to the north or to the northwest, depending on where you are. If you're in Europe, you're going to pray to the south, or sorry, the northeast and the southeast. So it really depends on where you are in the world as to what direction you're going to face. For a lot of times in Christian churches, you're always facing the east because the sun rises in the east, like Jesus rose from the dead according to Christian teachings. The holy book of Islamic faith is the Quran. This is an example from Unit 7 as well, and it is the sacred text. It's mentioned that these, as I mentioned, these were revealed to Muhammad by the angel, via the angel from God. And the importance of the word in Islamic culture, the actual writing of these words of God, makes calligraphy a very powerful art form. And we will see in several structures the art of calligraphy worked through the design. So you'll see this here, written in the Kufic script. And because figural imagery, human and animal forms, is considered inappropriate for sacred spaces, there is this idea that only God, Allah, can create life. We will see instead a great deal of vegetal motifs, geometric patterns that will decorate not only Qurans and Quranic scripts, and you see that kind of on the right side, you see that palmette at the bottom. We'll also see this throughout the different mosques that we look at, but that doesn't mean that figural or iconic imagery isn't used in secular spaces. So we'll kind of have to talk about that as we go through. Islamic religious architecture is very closely related to Muslim prayer, which is the obligation of all Muslims according to the Quran. Worship can be private or communal. It is largely communal, and a lot of the mosques we look at in the image set are Friday mosques, which are meant to hold the whole population of a town or a city. So the mosque is the name of the house of worship. These Friday or great or congregational mosques, again, meant to hold an entire population for the Friday noonday prayer. The Qibla wall is the most important wall, and you can see that here on this plan from Kairouan. And that is the wall that is closest to Mecca. That is how you know directionally that you're facing the right way towards Mecca when you pray. And inside of that wall, there is a mihrab, or a semicircular niche, often marked with a dome in the front over it or in front of it. And those are really the required elements. A lot of mosques are hypostyle halls. So they are these large spaces filled with columns. There is an imam who will lead the collective worship. He may stand on a minbar or work from a minbar to lead the worship. There's also a maksara, which precedes the mihrab. That's generally the area for the ruler or the elite. It tends to be elaborate as a result. And then some mosques will have minarets, some won't. Those minarets, they may have one, they may have them built into the facade, they may have them freestanding. Some mosques will have iwans, like the Mosque of Isfahan, which is in Unit 7, which are these rectangular recesses on the courtyard. A lot of these mosques will have courtyards in front of the worship space, a lot of times with a fountain, so you can wash yourself before prayer. When we look at Islamic decorative motifs, what we see again are a lot of geometric patterns, floral patterns, vegetal patterns, the use of the word of the calligraphic script as a decorative element. They're working with molded stucco, brickwork, geometric patterns in tile, natural forms, very stylized, arabesques, tendrils, stalks, and the calligraphy translates into all different media forms, as you can see here. And one of the sites where we see some of these applied, again, this one from Unit 7 is the Dome of the Rock, a shrine that is very lavishly decorated with faience tile, marble, and you see that gorgeous blue decorative tile work on the exterior, as well as inscriptions from the Quran worked into the facade. Our first structure from Unit 3 is the Great Mosque, or the Mezquita, in Córdoba, Spain. And if you remember your map, the Islamic group, the Islamic faith, makes it all the way into southern Spain, and almost all the way up into the cover the Iberian Peninsula at certain points in history. This is one of the oldest structures that's still standing from the time that the Muslims ruled Al-Andalus, which is Muslim Iberia, again, most of Spain, Portugal, and a small part of southern France in the late 8th century. It's about a 2-hour train ride from Madrid, very close to the Alhambra. And it's commonly believed that this was originally a Christian church that actually was dedicated to St. Vincent III, and then it was divided and shared by Muslims and Christians after the Islamic conquest. And that arrangement lasted until about 784, when the Emir Abd al-Rahman I basically purchased the other half and decided to bulldoze the original structure and build the new mosque. That narrative has been challenged. There's not a lot of evidence to support it, but it is certainly one interpretation that we have of this structure. Now, because we're in Spain and not in Central Asia, Prince Abd al-Rahman, when he escapes to Spain after after the upset, he brings the Umayyad dynasty to Spain. He establishes control in the Iberian Peninsula, and he chooses to build a mosque that resembles some of what he had back at home. So he plants fruit trees and other plants from his former home in Damascus. So there are orange trees. You can see the grove of orange trees in the upper photo in the Mosque of Córdoba, which gives a bittersweet reminder of Umayyad exile. So this conscious decision making, again, to include the trees there, something special to this mosque. It was expanded several times, and you can see that in the plan on the right, by different members of the Umayyad dynasty. And for the most part, it expands to the south and to the, I guess that's the west. And you have arcades in the prayer room, yeah, that expands southward, and the existing Qibla wall remains steady because of its location closest to Mecca, although there is a mihrab and doors to the treasury that get added down the road. Once inside the hypostyle prayer hall, and again, this is also one of those conscious decisions that is very contextually specific, we see kind of an unusual arrangement for a prayer hall. We see these double horseshoe arches in red and white voussoirs, and it has these a courtyard of sorts in front with the orange grove, and you walk in and you're completely taken over by this sense of all of the columns. I visited this site in 2005, it seems a million years ago, and I was struck by the rhythm of the different elements, as well as the overwhelming feel of how small I felt inside. It's built from recycled ancient Roman columns from the Visigoths, so it's technically using something called spolia, which is repurposed stone for new construction. So you can see those short columns down below that kind of look a little bit dark or purple. At the top, they've taken, again, they've created double horseshoe arches, which become somewhat symbolic of Islamic architecture, as well as the use of the red and white voussoirs, which we also can see in the Dome of the Rock. The reason for this, it allows higher ceilings than those low columns would allow. And so it's reminded the ancient worshipers it was meant to kind of channel this idea of palm trees in the desert, or this kind of oasis of the faith. So the horseshoe style arch, very common in the architecture of the Visigoths. And then when the Umayyads arrived, they also adopt it, as well as these leftover columns into the structure itself. And you can get the sense here of that forest of columns when you walk in. Now today, this also doubles as a cathedral site in Córdoba. So it's actually when Ferdinand and Isabella reclaim the Iberian Peninsula in 1492, they turn this back into a Catholic church, although the remnants of the mosque are still clearly very visible. This is also one of the 3 sites that claim to have part of Columbus buried here. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but apparently Córdoba also claims his remains and have interred them. The Great Mihrab at Córdoba, you can see here kind of as two separate images, the dome that's in front, and then I gave you the combined image of how it kind of looks in situ. And it's the focal point of the prayer hall, of course, because this is the wall that faces Mecca. This is the direction to which you face. And the Mihrab itself, what it actually did, that's still a little bit out there in the ether, I guess, for some scholars. They think that possibly it had to do with a niche in the wall of Muhammad's home where he might have stood and led the recitations of prayer. You see gold tesserae, this dazzling combination of dark blues, reddish browns, golds, very lavish, intricate calligraphy all around the mihrab itself here as well. The dome, equally dazzling, these crisscrossing ribs, again, covered in gold mosaic that create this radial pattern. And so Córdoba itself is a great example of the Muslim world's ability to adapt and to develop architectural styles based on pre-existing regional traditions. And so we see this kind of extraordinary combination of familiar and making sure you have all the elements of the mosque that are required, as well as the innovation of having to incorporate new architectural vocabulary and materials. If we take a look at the plan and kind of compare it to another hypostyle hall that we deal with in Unit 2, the Temple of Amun-Re in Karnak, you may notice that they have some similarities but some differences. So let's take about 30 seconds and take a look at the areas just in the red boxes, and then we'll kind of talk about what maybe they have in common and how they differ. So these are both hypostyle hall plans. The Temple of Amun-Re, which we'll look at in a couple weeks, or a week or so, I guess, is an axial plan, meaning it divides pretty evenly down the center. And the access to the interior of the temple and the hypostyle hall was very limited in the Egyptian culture. The further you go in, the more access gets restricted. There were 134 sandstone columns in the center. 12 of those were 69 feet tall, and they were so large on the top that they could fit up to 100 people if they were all standing up there. In Córdoba, this may have started as an axial plan, but the expansion over time changed this. So we have a much smaller scale hypostyle hall, doesn't have quite the height of what we see in Karnak. We have the horseshoe arches, and we also have greater access. This is a Friday mosque, so the masses, the population of Córdoba would have been allowed into the inside. Also from the Umayyad culture, we have this Pyxis. So this is an example of a secular work. How do I know right off the bat? I see people and animals. So we've looked at an Umayyad sacred space. So now let's look at a luxury object produced by the same culture. So a Pyxis is a cylindrical box used for cosmetics. A lot of times they were left open in a room with vials of perfume to kind of make the air smell sweet or fragrant. And this is probably among one of the best surviving examples of the royal ivory carving tradition in Islamic Spain. It was a gift for the 18-year-old Al-Mughira, the son of the Caliph, probably thought to be a coming of age present. And so it contains an inscription on here, which is how we know it belonged to him. And that's important for understanding the purpose of the object. The Pyxis, we think, was from a piece of elephant tusk, probably a cross section, and it's adorned with very specific royal iconography that speaks to the power and authority of the Umayyad dynasty. So again, conscious choices reflecting what we get here as an object. Elephants are not indigenous to the Iberian Peninsula, so this would have been imported, and it would have been considered precious or a precious stone, and ivory is also very hard to carve. You would have had to have the skill and been able to commission someone with that skill to get this kind of work done. So Ivory objects have had a history of being prestige objects since the Roman Empire, but to get one like this is certainly something quite special as a gift. And a pyxis is not a new type of object. They have been around for quite some time. The Athenians made them out of wood and ceramic. As we turn our attention to this one in particular, maybe looking a little bit at the inscription on the lid, you can see that, again, the use of calligraphy here as a design element, which is really important. This was given to the youngest son of the deceased Caliph Abd al-Rahman III, and his dad was the one who started the Mosque of Córdoba, and Abd al-Rahman III actually did one of the expansions. So Al-Mughira was 18 years old, and the inscription says in Kufic, around the base, God's blessings, favors, joy, beatitude to Al-Mughira, son of the commander of the faithful. May God have mercy upon him in the year 357. And again, that's a different calendar timeline. For our time, for Western time, it would be the year 968 CE. The iconography also had very special meaning. We think that Al-Mughira, as his brother was killed, he was the successor, and he was a threat to a rival trying to take the power. And so what we see here, again, this idea that this for a royal heir, the heir apparent in this case. So we see 8-lobed medallions surrounded with figures and animals, falconers, wrestlers, griffins, peacocks, birds, goats, animals of all kinds. We know that things like the lute player with the 2 figures with the braided scepter and the flask of the Umayyads, speaking to the symbolizing the Umayyad Caliph, maybe a reference to Al-Mughira's right to the throne. We also see, because of the presence of all these human and animal forms, that Islamic art is not all aniconic. There's another medallion showing a lion attacking 2 bulls. In Arabic poetry, lions symbolize the victorious, in this case, the Umayyads. So several different iconographic meanings here. Again, the choice of what's carved on here as important as the material and the inscription. Other examples of Pyxides, that is the plural form, they were coming out of Syria in ceramic form. So these aren't always ivory objects, so they can have different forms, again, depending on where they're being produced. There was a huge ivory carving workshop in Al-Andalus, or Islamic Spain. So we get a lot of them coming from the Umayyad court made from ivory, but other Islamic dynasties and courts were producing them, as you can see, again, in ceramic or even in bronze with silver inlay. The Alhambra is our final Islamic work in Spain that we have in Unit 3, and it's from the final Islamic dynasty to rule Spain, or to control the Iberian Peninsula. It's distinct among medieval palaces because it's a very sophisticated, well-planned complex with specific decorative programs, lots of gardens, lots of fountains. There's water running through there, so they figured out a way to channel the water from the mountains to basically irrigate all of these very rich gardens, and I'll show you a picture of those as well. The Alhambra, which means red fort, was built by the Nasrid dynasty, again, the last Muslims to rule Spain. It's nearly 26 acres, and it includes structures that have very distinct purposes: a residence for the ruler and his close family, a citadel, and the Alcazaba, which is the barracks for the elite guard who are responsible to secure the complex as well as protect the ruler. There's also an area called Medina, or city, where the court officials lived and worked. So the different parts of the complex are connected by paths, gardens, and gates, highly ornate interior spaces. And really, we talk about the three big palace structures are the Palace of the Lions, the Comares Palace, and the Pardo Palace, each of which is built in the 14th century. Charles V, who will come in after his grandparents, Ferdinand and Isabella, take the region back from the Muslims, he will come in and he will add a 4th palace in his reign. So when we look at the decorative work in the Alhambra, again, we see lots of calligraphy. You can see it at the top of the capital of this column here. Stucco work, so they would stucco the wall and then carve this very intricate design work. Tile work, you see here at the bottom, the dados, or the lower portion of the wall, done in these geometric forms, really intricate interlocking patternings, all of this, and inlaid wooden ceilings as well. From floor to ceiling, it's nothing but complete decadence of decor. This I thought was interesting. This is one of my pictures from the Alhambra, and this is the floor of the palace added by Charles V. And I know this because when I look, I see the Habsburg eagle, and there's also a small tile of Charles V in kind of a sultan's hat. This was their summer palace in Spain. And so I put a picture of Charles V up there. And if you know your history and know your Habsburg portraits, you know they all had a kind of unfortunate pronounced chin from unfortunate inbreeding that happened as they kept trying to solidify and strengthen their dynasty. Cousins married cousins, and it got a little bit sticky there. So I thought that was just kind of an interesting aside that we see these different elements from the actual Spanish editions still kind of in keeping with the original Islamic portion with all the decorative tile work. The Comares Palace was the residence of the Sultan, several rooms and galleries with porticos at the end, and probably the most famous part of this room or this palace is the Hall of the Ambassadors. And again, you see that dado tile work on all the lower portions of these walls, the very decorative stucco carving. And if you look into these niches, you see the lattice windows that covers the windows to give shade as well as light during the heat of the southern Spanish sun. A couple things interesting about this site. This is the room, this area right here, the roped off area, is where Columbus knelt down to ask for money to go to the New World. Over here, you can see the niches where Ferdinand and Isabella would have sat to receive that request. You also see one of the chairs here. There wasn't a terrible amount of furniture in the Alhambra when I visited. And this chair was designed to be a saddle for a horse or, depending on the region of the world, a camel. So you would strap it to the underbelly of the animal. And then when you got off from your travels, you would bring it inside and then you would sit in it in the court. Some more examples of stucco work and some of the inlaid bronze wooden ceilings. This whole place, I mean, you were just completely overwhelmed with the beauty of all the detail here. And the Court of the Lions is another one of these exceptional sites on the grounds. It's the main courtyard of the Nasrid dynasty and the Palace of the Lions, as well as the other rooms in this palace were built by Muhammad V. So this is kind of a new style that mixes a little bit of Christian and Moorish influence in this Nasrid style. The Courtyard of the Lions is an oblong courtyard surrounded by a low gallery on 124 white marble columns. There's a pavilion at each end of it that projects out into the courtyard, and probably its most famous feature is what you see on the right, the Fountain of the Lions, a magnificent alabaster basin, and all of the water lines you can see they come in from all different directions for the fountain, and this is kind of that example of that kind of engineering genius where they're managing to irrigate and bring water into the site for use. So the Lion Fountain, again, where the lions came from, that's a little bit of a mystery at times. It's been asserted they were from the house of a Jewish vizier, but it's not known if they were made before his death or at the time of his death. He had said he wanted to build his own home larger than the palace of the king, so these could have been taken from him as some sort of punishment. The Generalife, these gardens in the time of Ferdinand and Isabella, when they sent out people all over the globe to explore, not just Columbus, but others, they requested that they bring back seeds. So there are seeds of different plants from all over the Spanish Empire. The American magnolia grows here, as well as some other plants not indigenous to the region. The Generalife means garden of the architect, and it's originally probably the architect's house that was composed of several large gardens that eventually was taken over, and they're absolutely stunning at all times of the year. Now, let's take a little break in the middle here for some AP Art History shout outs. Again, if you have anything you want to get in touch with me about, you can reach me at acnapier at AC Napier CB. So the first person I want to give a shout out to is Leonardo da Vinci, whose birthday was yesterday. He was born April 15th, 1452. I also want to say hello and give some shout outs to some of our very important AP Art History teachers that are really working hard to keep you guys on track and get you ready for the exam. Lloyd Cornwell at Liberty High School in California, Meg Garcia at Sweetwater Union High in California, Jesse Hernandez, who's working with kids all across the state at Virtual Virginia, and Dana Zumbum at Lansdowne High School in Virginia Beach. And if you're interested in getting a shout out for you or your friends that are also art historians or your favorite artist or your teacher, please send me a message at Twitter. So AC Napier CB, would love to hear from you. And we'll get back to the action now. Mosque of Selim is our other structure from Unit 3 that we need to kind of address. And again, we're in a different part. We were in Europe, as you can see on the map. We were on one side. Spain's way over here. Now we're going to the other extreme of the Muslim dominions, back to the portion of Europe, which is right next to Asia in the area of Turkey. So we talk about the Mosque of Selim, or the Selimiye complex, as it's often called, built by the Sultan Selim II, the son of Suleiman the Magnificent, and designed by the architect Mimar Sinan. Edirne was selected because Selim II had a fondness for the city. It had a certain historical and geographic significance, of course. It's located in the Balkans, and it's really the last part of Europe before you cross into in the Ottoman Empire, before you cross into the Asian portion of the empire. And Selim was also stationed there for a little while by his father, and so when he was getting his military training. The architect, Mimar Sinan, or Sinan the Great, considered the best architect in all of the Ottoman Empire. He perfected the Ottoman mosque architecture, worked with a lot of rulers, Suleiman the Magnificent and the Sultan Selim II, only two of them. So he's also credited with addressing and solving the issue of a unified central space. He was born a Christian, he converts to Islam, and he becomes the most talented architect in the region. When we look at the Mosque of Selim, and there's a statue of Sinan in the front, you see that it stands at the center of a kuliye, which is a complex of a hospital, a school, a library, and baths, which all are around the mosque. There's also schools there, as well as a row of shops. You can see 4 minarets, which are not required by mosques. It's not one of the things that you have to have a Islamic religious structure, but they are pretty common. These are used to call the faithful to prayer. For Sinan, the architect, it was believed that circular architecture could affirm the oneness in humanity and this idea of a simple ideology of the circle of life. And he was always looking for this kind of idea of the unification of symmetry of architecture. And so this idea was to evoke God's perfection through the plain and powerful structure of the dome and the stone laid bare. So we don't see a lot of decorative motifs on the exterior of this mosque. As far as the plan, the complex is huge. It's more than the length of 2 football fields. And again, it has the mosque as well as several other structures. And all of the required elements are here. The Qibla wall, the mihrab, the minbar, minarets, and the maksara, all of these things that we tend to see from mosque to mosque to mosque, although they are laid out slightly differently here than we saw in the mosque at Córdoba. Sinan's effort was to make a structure that made the mihrab visible from any location. So he pushes it back into an apse-like alcove with enough space to allow for window illumination. And this has the effect of making the panels in the lower walls sparkle. Of course, everything sitting under the magnificence of this great dome, which seems to simply float above, the elements of calligraphy, geometry, the arabesque, floral and vegetative patterning all present here. The monumental exterior proclaims an interior proclaim the wealth of the Ottoman Empire. Light seeps in through a multitude of tiny windows, but the Selimiye did not only amaze the public with this kind of extreme symmetrical exterior, it astonished them with the gorgeous nature of the decorative program. When we take a look at the dome, which seems to be weightless as it floats over the prayer hall, the architectural features are really everything else is subordinated to this dome. It rests on 8 muqarna corbelled squinches. A muqarna is the faceted decorative form that protrudes and recedes. That's pretty commonly used in Islamic architecture to bridge a point of transition. In this case, the round base of the dome and the octagon on which this thing sits. The squinches are a form of architectural support, and they allow the round base of the dome to join using these piers that are also providing extra support. Let's take a quick check and compare the Mosque of Selim with the Church of Hagia Sophia, which is a Byzantine church also in Unit 3. So take a minute and think about how these things are similar. And how might Hagia Sophia have influenced the Mosque of Selim and influenced Sinan in his work? So I think if we do a basic visual analysis here, we can certainly see that each structure has the minarets, large domes, some semi-domes, half domes. The use of brick and stone is a common material. So these dome structures certainly do bear a lot of similarities. But Sinan actually is directly responding to Hagia Sophia. He wants to build something that surpasses it. So in a way, it inspires him to do something even bigger and greater. And it does that. It's pretty evident from contemporary writers' travel logs at the time that it was said no architect could match Hagia Sophia, and yet Sinan proves them wrong. On the inside, we can also talk about the support of the dome, the Mosque of Selim using squinches, while Hagia Sophia using pendentives, an octagon versus a four-sided quadrilateral base. The windows at the base of the dome still very similar though. In Hagia Sophia, we certainly see the remnants of the Christian structure there with some of the decorative elements. Since it was a Christian structure upon which Islam was imposed and not built as an Islamic structure, our decorative elements are certainly going to be there, be different, right? And Sinan seeking to build this monument again that surpasses Hagia Sophia to show the triumph of Islam. The interior of the Mosque of Selim, it's been repainted over the centuries. We've seen some different restorations. The tile work, the Islamic tile on the mihrab, largely untouched and original to the site. We see the large open floor under the dome for prayer. And of course, you would orient yourself to the direction of Mecca to the mihrab. What's unusual about the prayer hall, however, is the placement of the church's altar, ambo, the stand, I guess the muezzin's platform, the place where prayer is led from. You could compare it to kind of a church's altar, ambo in a Christian church. Where biblical readings would have been given, but it just seems to disrupt the space below the dome, and that's somewhat unusual to have something positioned like that in the center. Sinan, again, wanted to surpass Christian architecture, and so the position of the platform creates a vertical alignment of the square, the octagon, and the circle, and for him as the architect, the geometry helped connect the earthly and the heavenly spheres. On the exterior, we see that this kind of artful stacking of volumes. Unlike many earlier Ottoman mosques, as well as Hagia Sophia, the exterior is not an artistic afterthought. It is very elegant and an architectural shell that's vital to the overall composition. We have the pencil minarets at the four corners, the prayer hall focusing on the attention of the volume of the dome. Before we leave today, let's make a cross-cultural comparison to the Mosque of Janneh, which yet again we will see how the decisions made, how the construction, the forms, the styles, context matters and impacts yet another manifestation of an Islamic religious structure. So we turn our attention to the south and shift to the African continent. Our structure here built in 1200, but the most recent iteration completed in 1907. And scholars argue that this was done during that the French worked on it during the occupation, but there's no colonial documents that really indicate that. We have a tradition of masons that are, trained from generation to generation who create this mosque. It is believed, and they're using mud, sand, rice husks, water, and everything. They're making these bricks and to work in an adobe style. So rectangular sun-dried bricks, and then at some point the bricks become a little more ovoid, which may show some influence of French techniques. The masons integrate palm wood. You can see those those pieces of wood sticking out, the torans, which is kind of a built-in scaffolding, because this earthen architecture, which is found throughout the region of Mali, which is where we are, the country, and then we're specifically in Jenne, has to be replastered every year. The walls are thick. They provide insulation from the heat of the sun, but the rainy season can literally melt the building unless you add an additional coat of plaster. And so this will be done in an annual ritual every year to the mosque, as well as to your own individual homes and structures. So made from adobe and any other organic material, including, like I said, mud, sand, straw, dung, rice husks. We see this structure is built. It has the open courtyard, like our other two mosques. The building here is post and lintel construction, though, so no horseshoe arches in this one. We have torans that help to reinforce the mud brick as well as serve as a scaffolding. Of course, our other structures that we've looked at may have required some restoration over time, but they do not, of course, require an annual treating of the coat of the exterior with this coat of mud. So the thick adobe and mud brick walls, a response to local and environmental conditions. This is a tradition here. And you have to be very careful when you start looking at other architectural traditions. You don't want to have kind of a westernized snobbery that maybe if they had stone, they would do it with stone, or it might be better. This is a choice, a conscious choice. So we always want to be very careful not to not tip our hat in a direction that's not really accurate. So what we see here is an insulation from the heat, as well as maintaining a constant temperature on the inside, that elevated platform helping protect the mosque from the annual flooding of the river. And so the monumental exterior with its projecting elements, it does have minarets. They are built into the facade here, so not freestanding. So that would be kind of different from what we've seen in the other structures. On the roof, we have a ventilation system, again, responding to the intense heat of the region and the local architectural solution to the environment in which this is built. Ostrich eggs on the top refer to pre-Islamic cultural concepts of purity and fertility. And on market day, which is Monday, we have a large group. Everybody comes here to exchange daily goods, meat, fish, household stuff. And so you can come here and do your daily trading. You can actually see the megaphone for the minaret in this view right here. So you can see how they're built in. Taking a look at the inside and the plan, we have another hypostyle hall mosque. This one, again, with a completely kind of different interior with a soaring height compared to the buildings around it, but a very heavy interior with thick columns, not like the Mosque of Selim at all, which is largely an open space. But we could compare it to the Mosque of Córdoba with that hypostyle hall and that sense of a forest of supporting elements. Comparing it to local architecture, you can see that this is not just a style used for the mosque, that we see that this mud, adobe, earthen construction is indigenous to the region. So the appearance of the construction, again, continues a long history of mud masonry. A couple images of the crepissage, or the annual mudding. The mudding festival in which the whole community participates. The men do the plastering, the women prepare the mud down at the river, and you have to wait till the mud is ready. You can't just make mud. And then the kids run it back and forth with baskets and buckets on their head. It looks like a heck of a good time, to be honest. So things to consider. And this is important for all of art history. Context matters. Where it's built, is it secular or sacred? We see all of these different mosques, all with the same faith, all meeting certain requirements, but all very different in character. Are they using spolia and double horseshoe arches? Are we using mud brick adobe? Is there a dome or no dome? The importance of calligraphy that we see in some mosques, we don't see that in the decorative plan at Jenne. So instead, the kind of torans form this exterior decoration. So some elements will always be there. Other elements will have to be adapted certainly to the context. And sacred versus secular, human and animal forms versus none. All of that has to be factored in as well. So while mosques require certain components, the Qibla wall, the mihrab, that have to be there to meet the components of the religion or the requirements of the religion. Again, availability of materials, preferences, traditions of building, preferences of patrons all factor in. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to kind of cruise through this somewhat quickly. We attribute this painting for homework. John gave us the image of the conversion of St. Paul by Caravaggio. And so, you know, when you get this idea of an attribution, it's important to maybe connect it to the image set. So the image we have in the set is the calling of St. Matthew. And we see that, again, that scene set with that dark stage lighting, the sense of coextensive space, the large scale as if we're almost brought into the work, intensive chiaroscuro, natural models. All of these things point to Caravaggio's artistic signature. For your AP practice, you're going to work with this question on tradition and change. I want you to take a look at the Great Mosque of Jenne. I want you to connect it to the rest of Islamic architecture. Think about the materials used in the construction, use specific evidence to show how it shows continuity in the global conventions of mosque architecture, and use specific evidence to show how it demonstrates change from global mosque architecture. So I'll give you a second to take a little snapshot of this or a screenshot. And then before we go, a lot of people are sharing their senior pictures in solidarity with the class of 2020. I'm so sorry you guys have lost the rest of your senior year. Here's mine from, good Lord, 30 years ago. But I was curious because I don't know how this makes you guys feel. Is this something that helps you? Is this fun? Or is this just something us old people are doing to kind of share our senior pictures? So what I'm wondering right now is, if you want to send me a tweet, let me know what you think about all of us old people sharing our senior pictures. If you're interested in Jack and Lovey, my pups, who I tend to like to share with you, you can follow them they're on Instagram at the hashtag Lovey and Jack. But please get in touch with me at AC Napier CB on Twitter and share your thoughts, share some ideas. Is there anything you're struggling with art history, or you're worried about with the exam? I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to get in touch if you're having access issues at cb.org/tech. And that's all for me today. Thanks for your time. And as always, stay healthy, art historians. See you next week.